Good afternoon. I am Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, the Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for another installment of our Summer Survivor and 2G Speaker Series. Before we get started today, I want to thank our sponsor for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series, Ernst & Young LLP. I'd also like to thank our community partners for this series, Avance North Texas, Communities Foundation of Texas, Educational First Steps, Faith Forward Dallas, George W. Bush Presidential Center, International Rescue Committee in Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Reach of Dallas, SMU Human Rights Program, and Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. We couldn't do this without your support, and we appreciate it. So today you are in for a very interesting and I think riveting story from Max Glauben. Mr. Glauben is a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, a whole series of camps, and goes on after the Holocaust to rebuild his life here in America. And he is going to share his testimony and story of what he experienced during the Holocaust. And after about 45 minutes of testimony, he will break and we will open this up to question and answer. You will find the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, please feel free to type in whatever question you might have for Mr. Glauben, and in about 45 minutes, we will turn things over to a question and answer series with him. Okay, Max.
Good afternoon. I'm going to take my mask off to tell you that I am really following the rules of the doctors.
We're missing your little top of your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I held my breath while you were putting it on. But I just wanted for everybody to make sure that they do wear their masks, because it is very important, not for their own health, but for the health of others. I was born, first my name is Max Glauben, and I was born in Warsaw, Poland, in 1928. I had a family that consisted of many, many people. My immediate family was my mom, my dad, and also a little brother that I had that was a couple of years younger than me. We had a nice life, middle class. My father was a newspaper publisher. It was a daily Jewish publication, of which I was able to obtain a copy in the new Jewish Museum in Warsaw. And we lived a normal life. I went to a regular school, and then later on to a school that taught you how to speak Hebrew, with maybe the idea of some of us being, I can't find the word, but some of us to immigrate as youth to Israel when that country would become a state of Israel, or when Zionism started. The name of the school was Atid, and I could walk daily to the school. But sometimes we encountered some unpleasantness about bullying and other things. When the year of 1939 came, September 1st, I remember coming back from school and getting into my house, an announcement on the radio that Germany, without any notification, invaded Poland. Within 1 month, after the extensive bombing that the Germans did by using a new type of warfare called the Blitzkrieg, the western part of Poland was completely damaged. All the structures and manufacturing places. And Warsaw was captured at the end of September, maybe at the beginning of October. The Germans occupied Warsaw. The city of Warsaw had 3% of Jewish occupants. Therefore, that city and its structures were completely just about demolished. So when the Germans came in, they claimed that there were not enough structures, and for other reasons, they didn't have enough structures to do the administrative, the military government that would govern Poland, and Warsaw was its capital. So they switched the capital of Poland from Warsaw to Krakow and built the facilities for the military government to run Warsaw. So it was run from Krakow and not from Warsaw. Immediately upon entry, the Germans enforced the laws that they made in 1933. You know, some of the years that our older people kind of blend in. In 1933, into the population of Poland. If you were Jewish, one of the first things, you had to register and answer questions that you wouldn't answer living in a free society. After that, you were told about the laws that were made, such as discrimination. Any rights that a Jewish person had was not his. Professional people could not practice their profession to the public at large. The places that we worship in were not available because they were bombed out. Therefore, having any radios or any news media was sometimes a death sentence. Then you were told what you could wear and what you couldn't wear. Then you also had to wear an armband, which was required. That was a white armband with a Star of David in blue on it. But that was really enforced when we were placed in the ghetto. Looting became daily routine on the streets. If you were walking on a sidewalk and there was a German soldier approaching you, if you were Jewish and maybe had a cap on or a hat on, you had to step off the sidewalk, bow down, and remove your hat and have an expression on your face that was suitable for the German, because if you were not in a pleasant mood showing him your feelings, you would disappear, not too much by torture, but maybe by shooting or other acts that were committed toward us. With the money that was looted, the Germans decided to buy bricks and designate a 1 square mile area next to the Jewish cemetery and made the Jewish population that lived in that 1 square mile build the wall around that area. The wall was a 10-foot area. When it was started, it was the late 1939, and it was finished in 1940. When completed, it had 20-some gates that were not gated, but had arms that would go up and down and were guarded by a German and by a Polish policeman and also a Jewish policeman that we called capos, but the Jewish policeman was only an interpreter. Now I established the ghetto with the life. Now I'm going to describe the life in the area before the ghetto and then after the ghetto. First, before the ghetto, the city was destroyed. We immediately became people that lived under horrible conditions. There were not places where you could buy anything to eat. There were no utilities. The water that was drank by the population of Warsaw, whether it was Jewish or what, was either rainwater, water from the Vishla River, or in the wintertime, heavenly, melted from snow. And probably this water was probably the purest. We gathered water under the gutters, if there were gutters, but mostly there were ruins, but there were holes that were created by the bombs, and sometimes the rainwater would gather there, and we drank that. As far as the looting that I described to you, it was done firstly, and chasing was done firstly with the kids. They were the future generation, and they were a no-no. We as youngsters could not go to school. Our education was denied, and we were probably the first victims. The second group that was really targeted were our elderly, our educators, our leaders, and our clergy, our rabbis. The problems with them was that if they were, well, most of them were the clergy and the rabbis, and they were recognizable people. By that, I mean they had beards, they had long sideburns, they always had something on their head, whether it was a kippah or yarmulke, as they call, or a regular hat, and it was described in a religious way. Otherwise, the hat was made as described by the Torah or the 5 books of Moses. They also had attire, and they had the garments with fringes that they wore that represented their Judaic religion or the Hebrew religion. So they were really abused on the streets, and mostly on the streets, sometimes not in the places where they dwelled, because it was like a scenery that all the people could see what they were doing to them. So it was like a double penalty, a psychological effect and also a visual effect. Getting away from the life, we didn't have any food to eat. There were places close to farms that would set up little markets. That was bartering. There were other things. And if you live in poverty, you always find ways of sustain life. So I don't want to compare it, but there were many people living under bridges, whether it's veterans now, there are people begging, and there are people exchanging things and buying, bartering with diamonds. Well, this is the type of life that was started in the ghettos. But because of the conditions of health and cleanliness, any imaginable disease was in epidemic stages in all these areas, whether it was in the ghetto or on the other side, by 1943. When the ghetto was finished in 1940, and it took a horrible way of being built, because when we started building the Warsaw Ghetto, the conditions made an epidemic of typhoid that happened in the ghetto. The ghetto was quarantined by the Germans not allowed to go in to the ghetto, and the Germans created a city council of Jewish people inside the ghetto and made them appoint 2,000 volunteers to be policemen and do the dirty work for the Germans, because they didn't allow their soldiers to go in there and possibly catch typhoid. Therefore, the volunteers sometimes didn't want to volunteer, but their parents, and they registered at the beginning, so the Germans used tactics of blackmail that if you don't volunteer, I'm going to kill your parents and you, so you better volunteer or what. These people did the very work, sometimes being forced by the Germans. When the ghetto was completed, finally, all the people that registered around Warsaw and inside of the city of Warsaw that didn't live in the 1 square mile, they were forcefully placed into the ghetto, only being able to take with them what they could carry on their person. And this was winter time, and how would you know what to take with you, and how much could you carry? So the people that lived in the area and had their apartments had everything that they possessed that was not damaged by the bombing. But the ones that were taken in or placed in the ghetto had only what they carried. So there was a shortage of clothing, there was a shortage of everything, and we might have had a few doctors that would help us, but the enormous amount of people, of 500,000, placed in the 1 square mile with about 2,700 apartments that had an average of 2.5 rooms in each apartment, each room became a dungeon with maybe 6 to 8 people according to its size, and people were mixed. There was no family life. And if you had a piece of bread, you either had to hide it or put it somewhere on your body that it couldn't be taken away, because if a person didn't have any food, there were many things that they would do to you to take it away from you if you had it. Daily, we were called out of our apartments and taken either for sending to the 2 places that people were being taken from Warsaw, was Treblinka and Majdanek, where people were loaded on boxcars and taken to the death camps for gassing and cremation of the bodies. 1943, Germany was outside of Stalingrad. Why was that? Because what I didn't mention to you, when Poland was invaded, Russia had an agreement with them, or Germans had an agreement with Russia, that Russia will take the western part of Poland and Russia will take the eastern part of Poland. Simultaneously, the 2 armies took over Poland. They signed an non-aggression pact in Warsaw, and Germany later on invaded Russia and went up to Stalingrad, and things weren't doing so good on their front line. So they sent out a memo to everybody in the occupied zone of Poland and the Western Poland, and mainly in the ghetto, for the Jewish capos to deliver up to 5,000 people a day, and they were sending them to Treblinka and Majdanek. The capacity of these 2 was not great enough to destroy all the people. So they basically had them in barracks. Able bodies started escaping because the capabilities of killing were maybe 300 people a day, and that wasn't good enough to destroy everybody. And some of the people escaped that were capable of escaping, and they came from Warsaw. They still had families there, talked to the underground, and then the underground realized that the Germans were telling everybody that they were taking them to better places to live in, but they were actually taking them to the death camps for killing and cremation. Therefore, the underground started training youngsters age 18 to 25, both males and females, in warfare. They made many squads, and some of the youths, some of the youngsters like myself, became smugglers. And we would smuggle either through the gates or on certain wagons that were allowed to take wares made in the ghetto out and then make some of the items that needed to be manufactured in the ghetto in. So these were used for smuggling. The tunnels under the streets were used for smuggling. And sometimes kids were running through the gates because some of the guards might have been bought to allow certain things to be smuggled in to the ghetto. When the underground realized, they told all the smuggling groups, and we didn't know what we were smuggling because it was done in silence. Because if anybody knew what we were doing, we would be destroyed by informers that would see us do it. They told us to be very careful, that we're gonna bring in less food, but more articles that can be converted into military equipment. Thus, on April 19, 1943, the ghetto at that time was reduced from 20-some gates to only 15 gates because the population was dwindling and there were not enough people capable of pull the bodies out of the apartments into the streets or into the cemetery. So if anybody was trying to hide from the Germans or from the Jewish policemen, could run into their apartment and lay down and close their eyes because the apartments were smelly, with the bodies decomposing, and everybody that they tried to looked like they were dead. So they clean up and reduced it from 20-some gates to 15 gates and put us all in the corner of the ghetto. When the 15 gates were armed with the youngsters that were in squads, they put them in the apartments close to the 15 gates. I don't know how many squads, but enough to not allow the Germans to penetrate the walls of the ghetto. In 1943, to the point that the uprising started on the 19th of April 1943, with a lot of armed equipment like tanks and armor and a new general, they didn't allow him to occupy the ghetto until the end of May of 1943. In the meantime, my family and I were hiding and lived in the basements. We were moved 3 times in the Warsaw Ghetto. We originally lived on Mila 38, apartment 43, but then moved at the final stage on Muranowska Square, where the fighting started, and I saw really the first bullet fired in the Warsaw Ghetto. Going back to 1943, early part, the declaration and enforcement of the final solution that they're not gonna just kill all the Jewish people, but they're gonna destroy them. And when the uprising was going on, at the end of April, the only way that the German general with its soldiers could penetrate the gates of the Warsaw Ghetto was by bringing in napalm flamethrowers. We were hiding in a basement and the ghetto was burned. Anybody above ground didn't survive. We were in a basement that was behind a bake oven, which had maybe a little bit better insulation than some others, because many became gravesides. When the ghetto kind of cooled off, the Germans would walk with German shepherds, with dogs and listening devices, and then listen for anybody that might still be alive. And you know, if you live in a condition where the oxygen is drawn out because of the great heat that the napalm created, many people scream, many children cry if they're still alive. And then instead of helping, they would throw in a hand grenade, create an opening, and in our case, they had some people that were still alive, take them out with their hands up, disrobed us, searched us for any valuables, then took us over to a place where all the people were being gathered, and it was called the Umschlagplatz. There we were loaded on boxcars that were not standing next to a platform. There were plywood sheets, 8 by 12, that had pieces of wood on them, so when you climbed on it and you would slide down because they were in a 45-degree angle, the wood would stop you and you would be pushed into the cars. Never less than 100 people in there with no provisions of anything. Then the door was closed and it was standing room only, no bathroom, no food, just 2 little openings on either side that either had prison bars or some that were destroyed and had barbed wire that was not neatly done, but in a way that nobody could jump out of the car. Usually a ride, and I made 14 trips called the March of the Living when I went back with youth from some of the schools back to all the horrible places. From Warsaw to Majdanek, where we were designated. And I don't know why, because most of the transport went to Treblinka. It took 2 hours. Our ride to Majdanek from Warsaw took 5 days. And people might say, 5 days? How is it possible? When you are hungry, sick, or feel like a skeleton, mentally abused, brainwashed, sometimes an hour might seem like 2 days. But in reality, we were there for 5 days. We were offloaded in Majdanek, grouped like soldiers, 5 abreast, waiting for the Germans to set up checkpoints to select people that were capable of work in some of the concentration camps that were built next to German factories and supplied slave labor. When we were offloaded, it was after, when we got to Majdanek, the train stopped, that we were jilted with a switch engine that pushed us in about 1.5 kilometers from the main gate. Then we were set up 5 abreast. Finally, the Germans set up the checkpoints for selection. Then a loudspeaker, battery operated, said, "Women and children start marching." That's where I saw my family for the last time, because my mom was in a row with my little brother, and my relatives were in front of us. My father and I and a few other members of my male family was behind them. We were stopped, and then all the women and children weed out, and they went in right into the camp and into the crematorium area. My father was selected for work, and I was right next to him. I wanted to go with my mom, and my dad grabbed my father grabbed my hand, say, "Stay with me," and the Germans allow it. So we were put aside, lay down on the ground with a face down, while the procession was going in, where they were told, and there were other selections made wherever the Germans wanted. We were taken to a camp in Poland named Budzin, built next to an aeroplane factory. My father was well, anyways, the camp's commander was named Fikes. He would come out on a white horse daily and count about 4,000 prisoners. And after counting, ride on the horse behind the 4,000 people, and with a whip single out as many people as he wanted to destroy in front of everybody, to make sure that we did everything they told us to do without complaining, or we would end up the same way as that. The food that we received was 1 slice of bread a day and 1 bowl of soup a day, if the soup contained anything in it other than bouillon. And if you had a container that you can put it into, that you either made in the factory or they allow you to carry with you to obtain the amount of food that you want. After the counting in the morning, we would march in the sections that we were working in the factory, because these were civilian factories and we shouldn't do any sabotage there or whatever. We would have to sing and keep cadence while we were marching. About 3 weeks into that camp, I was working already as in the carpenter shop after lying that I knew how to read blueprints and making parts for the aircraft industry, the German, the Messerschmitt and the Heinkel. We marched out on a Friday morning, came back on a Friday evening. They counted us at a head count, which was just a head count, when we came back, and our group was 3 people short. They took 10 people for each one that was short, put them out in the middle of the Appel Square, which was a bit square that 4,000 people were being counted. That was on a Friday night. When I got up in the morning, I saw only my father's shoes. His body was gone with some other people. There were a few pair of shoes that were left there. That's the way I realized that my father was gone and I was orphaned. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of being too upset externally, but internally one cannot describe of what I felt after losing my whole family. But one thought was in the mind that never give up. And in our Jewish religion, if you save one life, it's the same if you save the whole world. And I realized, or I thought, that if I'm the only one with the name of Glauben, I wouldn't want it to be wiped out, like many others have been wiped out. And I did everything necessary with my defense system to try to survive and obey some of the things that they wanted me to do, and maybe vandalize some of the things or sabotage some of the things not in a physical way, but in a mental way. I don't know if this is understood. I was transferred from that camp to another camp, Budzin, where I was from Budzin to Mielec, where it was an airplane factory again. I was tattooed on my forehand with the letters KL, which stand for Konzentrationslager. And I stayed there for a period of time. Then I was transferred to Wieliczka, not knowing that the Allies were coming and all the camps were being closed. By the time I got to Wieliczka, there were dead bodies, fields of dead bodies. We were then, because there were too many people, they closed Budzin and they closed Mielec and put all the people there. So that camp that was maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people became a 12,000 people camp. Some of us were placed on boxcars, tried to offload in Auschwitz-Birkenau, but there were boxcars all over the tracks. So we were taken to Plaszów. Then from Pleschow I was taken to Flossenburg, Germany. There I stayed till April 16th, was called out in the middle of the night as a Jew only. That was the only Jewish transport that left Flossenburg. All the others were non-Jewish people that were left there. It was about 24 of us. We were placed on a boxcar. We were placed on a train with many boxcars. The moment the train left and got from Flossenburg to Floss, we were shot up by Allied planes. We were taken off the train, then the bodies taken off the train that were on there, then we were put back on the train, and then the train left again, it was shut up again. The remaining maybe 400 of us were made into two groups, and we went on a dead march from Flossenburg facing Dachau. While we marched from the 16th to the 23rd, on the 23rd we were placed on a hilly area in New Kirchen Balbini, and I only closed my eyes to remember the name. I couldn't pronounce it. But anyways, and we were surrounded with machine guns and told to stay there. But the Germans flew the coop because the American army was very close and liberated us on April the 23rd. While we were on that hilly area, there were two groups of less than 200 that met, because when they sent us out, they didn't take the whole 400 in one group. There were two groups. Then we met in Balbini or whatever the place is. When we were on the hill, we heard noise, and that noise was the tanks, American tanks. So about 7 or 8 of us tested our ability to run down the hill to find out what the noise was. And we did. So we screamed to the people on the hill, "Come on down, we liberated." After liberation, the Germans wouldn't let us into their homes for fear of what we might do to them. So we were told to look for a displaced person camp that the Allies were setting up for us. While we on the road looking for that, 179 Signal Repair Corps United States Army convoy is behind us, and a nice second lieutenant is in the front jeep of the convoy. He asked what we were doing here. "We're looking for a displaced person." He says, "You are not fit to do that." So he gave us uniforms, and he said, "Don't say anything, but you are my helpers." So I lived with the 179 after ending up in Nuremberg, Germany for 2 years, where I learned how to speak English, drive a car, and I became a mess sergeant for German POWs and Polish guards. 2 years later, 1947, I was able to get in touch with a US committee that allowed certain orphans that lost their whole families to apply for entry to the United States. I was placed in an orphanage in a Glashouse in Germany. I went to the council and Stuttgart, and I was placed on a United States merchant marine ship, USS Marine Flasher, and I came to the States on December 13, 1947, placed in an orphanage. Then I didn't like New York, so I was sent to Atlanta in a foster home with a Miss Rosenthal, and I didn't know it was a foster home, but I started my life in the United States. I worked. When I became 18, I was on a permanent visa, and I had to register for the draft. In 1951, I was drafted into the U.S. Army. I served 5 years, 3 years, 2 years active duty, 3 years inactive, and I served in Fort Hood, Texas. I went to food service school, and I became a mess sergeant at the 702nd Armored Infantry Battalion, Company B, of the 1st Armored Division. I was released in '53. During that period in Fort Hood, I would come into Dallas, where I met my lovely wife, Frida Gappelberg. And when I was released in 1953, I married. I have 3 grown children and 7 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. So from one person being liberated, I have now a family that exceeds maybe 20 because of marriage and other things. So you see, not only in Jewish life, if you save one life, it's the same way as if you save the whole world. They save one person on top of it, and I have 20 people to maybe replace of what was lost in the Holocaust. And that is my story. That is my abbreviated story. And I hope that you have some questions, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. But I don't drink a lot, but I'm going to take a sip of water, if you don't mind.
Max, thank you so much for sharing your story, and we do in fact have a series of questions to ask you.
Okay?
So, the first question is from Shannon Robinson, and she would like to know how you were able to get your family photographs that we see in the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Were you able to hide them and hold on to them during the Holocaust, or did you get them after the war?
I got them after the war. I had an uncle that, he passed away, but he was a pioneer of Israel now. I said I went to a school that taught Hebrew, so when Zionism started, that the kids would be sent to Israel and they'd be able to converse with the people there. My uncle went to Israel in the late 30s to a way where people were matched up. A young lady and a young lad were given marriage license so they could immigrate to Palestine, and he went there in the late 30s. When the war was over, he was trying to find me and never did, but finally, through Red Cross, I found him, and he had maybe 4 or 5 pictures. What we did with these pictures, as we broke them down. Some of the other ones, for individual ones, and some of the other ones I have from when I lived with the U.S. Army from 45 to 47, and they are current ones that were made after the war. So, and now I have family, the Nachmanis, that live in Israel, but even he didn't have too many pictures.
Thank you, Max. Melissa would like to know if before the creation of the ghetto, you and your family lived within the area that was going to be the ghetto, or were you forced into the ghetto from another area of Warsaw?
I lived on Mila 38, apartment 43, which was inside the Warsaw Ghetto. So we were more fortunate, and I mentioned that we had our belongings and the other people not. That doesn't mean that they didn't try to take them away from us. But no, but I did help in building of the ghetto, then in smuggling of the ghetto, because we were more familiar with the area than some of the other kids that lived away. But no, we lived, and we were able, because we lived there, so if we had any relatives, for them to switch with some of the people, so my family would live in our apartment because it was easier to live with family than with strangers. And that's how the population of ghetto lived, scattered.
Max, Betty Heath would like to know if you have ever considered removing your KL tattoo.
I came in 47 to Atlanta, and there was a doctor that wrote a book, and he was in prison in Japan. And there was another doctor that was a dentist, and they wanted me to remove it. And I would not consider it at all because it's a part of me, and I lived through it. And thank God that I am doing everything as a volunteer, of course, and a non-profit, and it allows me to look at this every morning when I brush my teeth, and every time I show my hand without being covered to make me a better person, because it reminds me what some people can do to some people, and it stops me from doing it. Or it makes me do a good deed every day to somebody in this world, to make this a better world.
Max, Jeanette Sexton would like to know if you have written your memoirs.
I have a young lady that graduated from Texas in Austin, and she's a wonderful writer. In fact, she's with USA Today in the National Football League with the Cowboys, And she has been writing my bio, memoirs, for 3.5 years. And there is a great possibility that at the beginning of 2021, we just heard about a publisher, and they might be published. Or they will be published. I make sure that they are. So they are going to be. And it's going to be a book that is written so people would read it and not that I would say, I wrote a book, you know. But I do have a DVD that is available in the museum when it is open, that I made in, 2006, I believe.
Max, Tapesh Dut Nagaria would like to know if you've ever thought about going back to Warsaw or any of the places you lived in Poland once you came to the U.S., and if so, what did you experience?
Not only, I mentioned in my speaking that I have a foundation, and anything that I get from the foundation would go to the museum, and also some of it to my foundation. And I am a strong believer in the march of the living. Therefore, your question will be answered, yes, I went back 14 times, not only to Warsaw, but to Majdanek, to Treblinka, which is not existing, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and many communities and what I found is a reversal and a betterment of what it was in those days, which proves to me, and I have a positive outlook. When I went at the beginning, nobody would speak to me. When I went there on the 14 times, people were glad to meet me, spoke to me, shook my hand, showed me around, which means that institutions like this museum, with some of the speakers like I am and some of the Holocaust survivors, that devote their time to tell people what it was like during the Holocaust, and also by doing what should be done instead of just seeing it and not saying a word, otherwise becoming an abstander. We must have done a lot of good through the years, because institutions like this teach you the right thing and bring up the expressions that you see all over the world now for freedom of individuals, for goodness that can be done to each other rather than the horrible things. And it also shows that through education we can eliminate a lot of the bad stuff, making it accessible to everybody. But you have to realize that there is a saying, and I don't want to compare it to humans, but you can take a horse and take him to a water well, but you cannot make him drink. So maybe we should become people that we work with individuals, individually, face to face, trying to educate them that we have the same, maybe a little bit different looking bodies, that they have, the same minds that they have. They may not be exactly the same, but they are like maybe a computer. You become the programmer, so program it in a way that'll do good rather than the bad. Because this thing reminds me what bad could be, and it keeps me away from doing it.
Thank you, Max. Our last question, which I think you just answered, but if you want to add anything, you let us know. If there's anything you'd recommend parents instill or teach their children to help them understand the Holocaust and help prevent atrocities like that from happening again.
I think that I don't write my speeches about what I'm speaking. If you tell the child, first, when they're born, of course, they got the motherly care. Now we have kindergartens and nurseries, and I have great grandbabies that are 4 years old that can recite prayers, they can dance, and they can tell you what to eat and what to buy. So it means that when they get all 3 or 4, don't keep them back. Give them love and somehow insist that they going in to a game of life. At their age, you can compare it with Las Vegas or any other places. But when you go into a place like that, you either win or you either lose, but something overcomes you. Let them get that feeling for life. There are bad things that happen, but if you survive, the bad things become good things because you have survived. You can obtain anything that you want through education, but you have to be the person that wants to get it. When you get to high school and you get to college, I consider that you are a programmer, and you are programming your computer to you liking. There is no profession, there's no position in this world that computer, if you program it right, could not do it. Even the president. So when you give love and you show him the right things to do, and there's a saying, the apple or the fruit doesn't fall far away from the tree. If you're a good parent, your child will pick that up. And I don't want to compare us with monkeys, but there's a saying, monkey see, monkey do. And this may be something that may be happening right now with all the visual things that we have, So in some instances, it's good, and in others, it's not. So the thing is, never give up. Eliminate the letter N from your vocabulary. If somebody asks you a question, don't say no before you know the question. So use a why
Thank you, Max. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Thank you, all of you who joined us. We hope to see you next week for our next in the series with Mark Jacobs, one of our second-generation survivors. I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.